Okay, so today's Bike and Psych. I'm going to talk about hoarding. So I just couldn't resist talking about the subject. So sure, I'm making this video at the time when everybody's well, good question, is it everybody? Probably not, but enough people are going to supermarkets and other places and just buying scores of provisions, toilet roll in particular, but pasta, rice, those sorts of staples. And it seems to me that everybody seems baffled by this. Why are people doing this? And everybody I've spoken to is blaming somebody else. So who are these people? Where are they? And you see the odd video with the odd guy with his trolley full of toilet rolls. So I guess that's one of them. But I'm just curious, clearly enough people are doing this to make it a problem, because the supermarket shelves are empty at the moment in many places. So the question is, what's going on? So I thought I'd do a bit of research. So I found a paper. I'm useless at remembering names, so I'll put the names of the authors on the screen here. But I found a paper that it's wonderfully titled. It's called "I'm Not Hoarding, I'm Just Stocking Up Before the Hoarders Get Here," which I think is a fantastic title. And then it's got a slightly more sort of academic descriptive after that. So actually that is a quote from somebody. I think it dates back to the war, which was probably the last time we had a problem with hoarding. So it's kind of not the first time we've experienced this, but the first time in most of our living memories, I suppose. So anyway, so the paper is trying to explain that phenomenon. So there's two things the paper is looking at, really. One is more relevant than the other for our purposes, but I'm going to talk about both of them because they're both quite interesting. So the first one is just literally people buying more than they need so that they can hoard it, in cupboards and sheds, I suppose. So that's simple hoarding. And the other one is called phantom ordering. So phantom ordering is when people will order things more than they need, because they're essentially hedging their bets, so that when they get as much as they need, then they can cancel the extra that they'd ordered. So this is particularly the case in professional commercial environments where you may be ordering raw materials for some production, so you put an order in for twice as much, or maybe you go to 2 different places and put an order in knowing that you'll cancel one of them. You're kind of hedging your bets. So phantom ordering. Now, of course, in the supply chain, that's a real problem, because that means the supplier has got bad information about how much they need to produce. So clearly that's an issue for them. If all of a sudden they have massive spike in orders, in theory they could increase their manufacturing capability, but that puts them at risk then if everybody cancels half of it. So anyway, they're the two phenomena that they're looking at. So hoarding and phantom ordering. So I'm going to focus more on the hoarding. Phantom ordering could become a problem if people start going on to multiple food shopping sites, I suppose, and then cancelling some if they get what they want. So, but I don't think that's I've not heard of that happening yet. So why are people hoarding? So the first thing to say is that there are kind of two ways of looking at it, and I've been trying to work it out what's going on. So on the one hand, there could be some rational explanations for this. You know, it's not completely irrational to be concerned about running out of something. So it could be that these are just rational, thought through, logical processes. So in my previous video I talked about the theory of planned behaviour by Dogan. So if you've not watched that, go back and have a look at that. But that's a much more rational model. So that says that, you know, people are thinking this through and deciding that the best thing to do is going and, you know, getting 4 times as much as they need. So that is a possibility. And the other possibility is that it is irrational and it's really an emotional response to something else that's happening. So this research takes an experimental design approach and looks at that and says, right, which is it? I mean, it's possible, of course, the third option is that it's a bit of both, and I think there's some fairly good evidence that there is a bit of both going on, but part of the purpose of this experiment is to try and isolate these two possibilities and find out, you know, what's going on. So the way they did this is they used an existing experimental design, which again I'll put up the references for that. I tend to stop talking when people are coming past because it looks like I'm talking to myself. So yes, this experimental design is a beer distribution experiment. So clearly it's a fictitious company. Thank you. And but the game is that you have people who is simulating ordering crates of beer for a pub or for a shop, and the test is, you know, how do people do that? Do they do that rationally, or is something else going on? So what they did to identify whether it was just emotional or whether it was rational was they tried to remove all of the rational reasons why you might overorder. So it's rational to imagine that your competitors are going to buy up all the beer. It's also rational to maybe imagine that there might all of a sudden be a big demand for beer. Although there's no evidence for it, you might say, well, I want a buffer to cope with a massive increase for whatever reason. And you also might be concerned about the price, and you might think that might change, or you might think there might for some reason be a drop in supply. So all of these we could describe as rational reasons, and would probably be an excuse, if you like, or a reason why you might decide to overorder. So if you're overordering one of those reasons, or some of those reasons, then okay, there's some logic to that. But what they did for this experiment is they removed all of those reasons. So they made it so that each person on the experiment only had one supplier, and that supplier was guaranteed that they would produce a certain amount. All the history showed that they would always produce the given amount, so they were never going to drop in production. And they also made it so that the experiment showed there was no chance, thank you, there was no chance of the customer altering their order. So they had predictable supply, predictable demand. They also made it so that there were no competition, because no producer would supply to another person. So there wouldn't be any of this competition worries that a competitor might buy up all the beer. So that was also eliminated. And I guess what they expected was that take away those rational reasons to buy more than you need, and people would just buy their normal 4 crates every week, which would be all that was necessary. But what was interesting, what they found, was that regardless of taking away those rational reasons, people still created what they called a bullwhip effect, which basically means they were ordering more than they needed, which disrupted the production, which meant sometimes they were short and then they'd catch up and so on. So you ended up with this uneven supply, and that was the case even when those rational reasons were taken away, which I think is fascinating. So this suggests that there is at least a significant emotional, irrational element to this. So it's not just people making kind of rational decisions, which I thought was really interesting. Another element of another finding from the experiment was that a decent proportion, I think it's about 20% of people, didn't just slightly overorder.
Thank you.
Oh look, you got a job now. Thank you. Didn't just overorder by a little bit. Okay, I'll start that sentence again. So about 20% of people didn't just overorder a little bit, they overordered by staggering amounts. You know, factors of 10 or more. It was just ridiculous. Now in business, having too much stock is actually really costly. So it's one of the things that you learn in lean processes is don't have too much inventory, because if you have a lot of stock, you've got to look after it, you've got to count it, and there's lots of costs associated with it. Of course, you've also got money tied up in it. So it's completely irrational to do that, and yet some good, 20%, that's a big number, were not just over-ordering, but massively over-ordering. So why are people doing this? So one of the new ways of trying to work out what's going on inside our brain is to do some neuro imaging. So some neurological studies have looked at people who have an extreme form of hoarding behaviour, which is now listed as a condition. So you might know somebody who does that, hoards loads and loads of stuff. It could be something, you know, like newspapers or things that are not really of much value, but they still hoard. So they looked at the brains of some of these people who were hoarders, and they found that the areas associated with these hoarding behaviours are separate to the kind of more rational decision-making areas of the brain. So behaviour around hoarding seems to be tied to the limbic system and the more emotional kind of, I suppose, ancient animal behaviours that are still part of us, really. So I thought that was quite interesting. So you could say then that we've identified a link between emotional responses and hoarding behaviour. So I think that's quite interesting. So in a way you can say that it's not always hello. Hiya. It's not always a rational thing. It's often an emotional thing, and suppose, yeah, I don't know what that makes us think about those people, but it probably makes us feel a little bit more like we can understand what's going on there. The other thing that the article pointed out was the well, it called it a positive feedback, and it's positive not in the positive means good sense, but it's a positive in the fact that it is a sort of self-confirming cycle, if you like, feedback loop of having triggers to tell you that there is a shortage. So if you go back to our evolutionary past, then we were obviously wired to be aware of variance in things that we need, resources, and we're pretty sensitive to any possibility that they might, we might have a disruption in one of those resources. So, thank you. So it's, what was I going to say? Yeah, so the evolutionary element that is in us that kind of wants to make sure that we've got enough to survive till the next day. I guess that's part of our behavioural evolution, really. Why would we not be programmed to do that? If you have a kind of laissez-faire attitude towards having enough resources, then you're probably going to die out. So we're kind of geared to do that, even though we live in a society now where the reality is there is plenty of toilet roll in those factories and in those warehouses. I visited a factory recently because I did some work for them who make toilet roll, and they make a lot of it, and they're a small supplier. These suppliers can produce enough, more than enough. So there's no real rational reason for behaving this way, but it's irrational, but based around, I suppose, those evolutionary behaviours that we have. So positive feedback means that if you keep seeing queues and everybody else is rushing to get this resource that apparently is in short supply, although it's not, but everything else is telling you that it is, then that can also make things worse, and of course it does. So you end up with huge great queues of people desperate to get this thing that there isn't a shortage of, really. Well, there shouldn't be a shortage of at all. So a few examples of that have been have been seen in the past, such as fuel shortages. So there's some examples in America of people queuing for hours to try and get their tank is nearly full anyway, but just to get that last little bit, perhaps fill up on some bottles. So again, it's this kind of anxiety produced by everybody else, which I think probably keys a little bit into the theory of planned behaviour. So if you've watched that video, you'll know that the second element on that diagram is the social norms. So if you think that subjective norms. So if you think that the normal behaviour is to, new normal is now to queue for toilet roll, or to fill your cupboard with toilet roll, you're suddenly out of step with everybody else if you say, no, I don't want to do that. So I think that's unlikely in the kind of comfort of your own home. If you go to the supermarket and you suddenly see loads of people picking up all this toilet roll, then I think it's probably quite hard to resist that temptation to think, well, everybody else is doing it, so I'm going to do it. Thank you. Yeah, so I think that second element, or the middle element of the diagram of the theory of planned behaviour, is relevant to that too. Okay, so I think I've exhausted all I can remember about that paper. There might be something I've missed, but the nature of these videos is, I'm kind of thinking on my bike, so I can't look it up. So I'm really interested to hear what you've got to say about that. You know, of course, I'm sure there's other ways of looking at this phenomenon, and that there'll be other sort of cognitive or behavioural models that you could look at. But I just found that paper really interesting. So I just want to say thank you very much for listening and watching.